Section 26 of Astounding Stories 16, May 1931. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Death Cloud, by Nat Schachner and Arthur L. Zagat. Part 3. Mechanically, I obeyed the sergeant's barked commands. We were in single file. We were moving toward that ominous table where the Ferret stood, a sardonic smile on his sharp-featured face. I could make out a livid weal across his throat. I had left my mark on him. That was some satisfaction. The head of the line reached the table. They were fingerprinting the leader. A lieutenant extracted a paper from the pile and handed it to the Ferret. He made momentary comparison of something on the paper with the mark the soldier had just made. Then the next man stepped up, while the first made off across the plain. Of course. Simple. How very simple. And yet it had caught me. The service records of the men had their fingerprints, just as in our own forces, and each man in the area was being checked up. Trust the Ferret to think of that. He knew that I'd be somewhere in their ranks impersonating one of their men. Well, I was in for it. The last trick in our long game was his. My turn. No use going through the motions. I bent down a moment, then straightened. "Oh, hello, Bolton," the Ferret said, thrusting out his hand, the one with the twisted finger. I had resumed my own visage. "Didn't think you could get away with it, did you?" Chagrined as I was, I put a good face on it. The Ferret and I had run up against each other many, many times. Cheerfully, either of us would have cut the other's throat, but we played the game. "Hello, Rubinoff," I responded. "You seem to have me just now, but try and hold me." The Ferret threw back his head and laughed. "Oh, I think you'll find it a little difficult to get away this time." I thought so too, but did not voice my thought. The smile left Rubinoff's face. He snapped an order. A squad advanced from the guard. Handcuffs clicked around my wrists. The mates of each were fastened to the arms of two guardsmen. I was securely chained. They were taking no chances. "Take him to the special cell in the guard house." The lieutenant saluted. I was marched off. Then I was not to be summarily executed. I was not as much relieved as you might think. You see, I knew the Ferret. We had raided one of his hangouts once. Just missed him. But we found an MIS man there whom Rubinoff had been questioning. We thanked God when he died. We tramped across the plain. My eyes kept roving about. There wasn't much hope for me, but miracles have happened. Most of the scattered structures were hastily thrown together sheds of sheet iron. Barracks, they looked like. But every so often I spied spheres of concrete, the wide open doors revealing yard-thick walls. What could be their purpose? Something bothered me. Something about the ray projectors and the other machinery I had seen. I glanced up at one of the balloons floating high above. All these needed a power supply. Tremendous power to accomplish what the ray was doing. And there were no cables running to them. How did the power get to them? There was only one answer. Radio transmission. The required energy, perhaps the very ray vibrations themselves, were being broadcast to the points of projection. That meant a powerhouse and a control room somewhere in the area. The vulnerable points. Where were they? I stumbled, and was jerked roughly to my feet. The lieutenant slapped me. "Scared, Amerikansky? You well may be. We'll have rare sport when they throw what the Ferret leaves of you into the ray." I shuddered. To go out that way, I'll be honest, I was horribly afraid. The men to whom I was shackled laughed. A dull throbbing beat at my ears, a vibration just too low to be sound. I looked about for its source. It came from my left, a concrete building, low-lying, about 100 yards long by as many feet wide. At the further end, a squat smokestack broke the flat line of the roof. Guards, many guards, were pacing their slow patrol about it. From the center of the side nearest me, cables thick as a man's trunk issued forth. I followed them with my eye. They ended in a marble slab on which rested a concrete sphere, somewhat larger than the others. The door of this one was closed. On the roof of the queer edifice was a peculiar arrangement of wires, gleaming in the artificial daylight. This building, too, was heavily guarded. I had found what I sought. The power house and the transmitting station. Much good it did me now. My warders turned sharply to the right. I glimpsed another concrete structure. A heavy steel door opened, then clanged shut behind us. The fetid odor that means only one thing the world over folded round me. I sprawled on the steel floor of the cell into which I was thrust. A wave of utter fatigue engulfed me. I felt great weariness of body and despair of soul. I had failed in my mission. The fate of my country had been entrusted to me, and here I was in a steel-floored, steel-walled prison cell. And that tunnel was rushing toward New York at 3 miles an hour, over 70 miles a day. I think I slept from sheer exhaustion, but something startled me into awaking. The dim light filtering in from the tiny air hole high up on one wall showed me that I was still alone. I lay, listening. There it was again, a wailing scream of agony that rose and fell and died away. I heard a grating sound at the door, and it opened and shut. Rubinoff, the Ferret, had entered. "Comfortable, Captain Bolton?" he asked, and there was more than a hint of mockery in the velvety voice. In the hand with the twisted finger was his ray tube. It pointed steadily at me. I got to my feet. I was in no mood for trifling, for that scream had shaken me. "Cut the comedy, Rubinoff," I growled. "Kill me, and let's have done with it." He raised a deprecating hand. "Oh, come now. There's really no absolute necessity for that. You can save yourself very easily." "What do you mean?" "I can use you, if you're amenable to reason." "I don't understand." "You're the cleverest of the American intelligence men. The rabble they give me are well nigh useless. Cast your lot in with us, and in a week you'll have the riches of your greatest city to dip your hands in. It's easy. There is certain information we need. Give it to us. Then I'll get you back into your lines. We'll cook up a good tale for Summers. You can resume your post and send us information only when it is of extreme importance. Come now, be sensible." At first blush, this was an astounding proposal. But I knew my man. He needed to know something. Once he had extracted the knowledge he sought from me, I should be disposed of. He'd never let me get back into our lines with what I had found out. It might have been policy to play him. But what was the use? "No, Rubinoff, you know I won't do it." He sighed. "Just as I thought. Honor, country, and so on. Well, it's too bad. We should have made a wonderful team. However, you'll tell me what I want to know. What are the defenses within 50 miles of New York?" I laughed derisively. "You'll save yourself a lot of trouble if you tell me, Bolton. After all, death in the ray isn't so bad. Whiff, and you're gone. Don't force me to other measures." There was a grim threat in his voice, but I simply shook my head. "Stubborn, like all the other Anglo-Saxons. Well, I've got something to show you." He raised his weapon and glanced at it. "Pretty little thing, this. Not the ordinary ray tube. Only field officers have these. Look." He pointed it at the wall from behind which that scream had come, and pressed the trigger button. A tiny round hole appeared in the steel. "Neat, isn't it? Utilizes the same ray you saw at work in the tunnel. The Zeta ray, we call it. Just think what that would do to human flesh." I said nothing. "But that isn't what I had in mind. Just look through that hole." I wanted to see what was on the other side, so I obeyed. The thing that lay on the floor within, could it ever have been a man? I whirled back to the Ferret in a fury, my fists clenched. His infernal weapon was pointing straight at me. "Softly, Bolton, softly. You'd never get to me." I checked my spring, for he was right. "How'd you like that?" he purred. "Some of your work, I suppose," I growled. "The poor fool was fomenting a mutiny. We wanted to know the other plotters. He was stubborn. What would you? Necessity knows no law. What are the defenses around New York?" He advanced menacingly. No answer. "Why be a fool? This ray hurts, I tell you, when it's properly applied. How would you like to be melted away, piece by little piece, till you're like that in there?" I shrugged my shoulders, but kept silent. "I tell you it hurts. You don't believe me? That in there is unconscious, 7/8 dead. Listen." He bored another hole in the steel, keeping his finger pressed on the trigger. Again that heart-rending scream of agony rang out, tearing its way through me. My brain exploded in red rage. I leaped for the fiend, reckless of consequences. My fist drove into the leering face with all the force of my spring, with all the insane fury that his heartless cruelty had roused in me. Smack! He catapulted across the floor and crashed into the wall. I was on him, my hand clutching for his tube. But there was no need. He was out. Dead to the world. So sudden, so unexpected was my mad attack that even he had not had time to meet it. I worked fast. In a minute I was in Rubinoff's uniform and had assumed his face. I was a little taller, no matter. But the finger, that would be noticed immediately. There was only one thing to do. I stuck my little finger through one of the holes he had made in the wall and twisted. Crack. Beads of agony stood out on my forehead. But the break was just right. By bending the other fingers slightly, I could hold that one in just the position of his. I picked up the ray tube with my left hand. If I went out through the guard house entrance, I might meet other officers and be engaged in conversation. That might lead to discovery. My cell was on the side of the prison away from the road. I had noticed no buildings behind it. I'd chance it. Luck had been with me so far. I carved out a hole in the wall pierced by the air hole. It was like cutting through butter with a red-hot knife. I stepped out. There was no one about. I walked carelessly around the corner of the building, my hand, holding the tube, buried deep in my pocket. Not far away was the spherical structure I had spotted as the control room. I returned salutes. No one stopped to talk to me. Would the guard before that building require a password? I heard a shout behind me. My escape was discovered. At once I broke into a run and dashed past the guard, shouting, "Prisoner escaped! Came this way!" The man gaped. The shouting behind me grew louder. I heard the thud of many feet running. I flung open the door, slammed it shut behind me, and turned the key. A long row of giant electrode bulbs, as tall as a man, stretched before me, the source of the Zeta ray. From here came the power that held back the waters, that bored the tunnel. A thunderous knocking shook the door. Someone at a huge switchboard turned toward me. Instantly my hand was out of my pocket and the ray tube leveled at the nearest bulb. I pressed the trigger. The bulb crashed. I swept down the line. Crash, crash, crash. They were all gone. I whirled to meet the expected attack. It was wholly instinctive, for in a second we'd all be dead anyway. The waters would be down on us. But the switchboard operator wasn't springing at me. Instead, he was tugging frantically at a long lever that came down from above. There was a clang, and a steel shutter dropped across the door. Then came a sound of crashing thunder that split my eardrums with its unbearable clamor. Then a mightier roar, as the mountain-high sea, held back so long by the invisible ray, poured its countless millions of tons of deep green water down into the man-made hole. The impact was terrific. The yards-thick concrete shuddered and strained. The tremendous pressure forced trickles of water into the concrete shell. The roaring of the elements was indescribably deafening. I was in pitch darkness, expecting every moment to be crushed under miles of ocean, when suddenly I was thrown from my feet. The floor was heaving drunkenly beneath me. In a moment I was slammed breathlessly against the shattered remnants of a huge vacuum tube. The jagged glass slashed my arms and face. I grabbed with my hand to steady myself, came in contact with an iron bar, clung like grim death. For a huge concrete sphere was whirling, tossing, gyrating in a welter of waters. The din was terrific. I rolled over and over, my arms almost pulled out of their sockets. Then, like a ton of brick, something collided with my head. There was a blinding flare in the black void, and I knew no more. Slowly I came out of a hideous nightmare. My head ached frightfully, and my wounds smarted and stung. It was dark, but a faint luminescence from somewhere enabled me to faintly discern my surroundings. I was wedged between a steel cable bracket and the curving wall. Across the glass-strewn floor a body lay, sprawling queerly. The room was swaying in long undulations, or was it my head? I lay helpless, unable to move. A leg dangled uselessly. There was a bump, the sound of scraping. I heard confused sounds penetrating the walls, and the jar of steady impacts. A half an hour passed so. Maybe an hour. I had no means of telling. I was weak from pain and loss of blood, and slightly delirious. A faint whirring noise, a sudden intensity in the illumination caused me to turn my head. The steel shutter was glowing red. Then a shower of white sparks broke through. The heavy steel was melting away into incandescence. It crashed. A group of men stumbled cautiously in. Now I was sure I was delirious, for the men wore khaki uniforms. Americans! Then, in my fever, I thought I heard a familiar voice cry out my name. It was Jim's voice. A roaring curtain of blackness shut down on me. When I awoke again, I was lying in a clean-sheeted hospital bed. Jim was sitting at the side, staring at me with gloomy eyes. "Hello, Jim," I gasped weakly. "How did I get here?" It was touching to see the instantaneous delight on his weathered countenance. "So you came to at last, you old son of a gun. Thought you were cashing in on us for a while. How did you get here? That's just what I want to know. How in hell did you get here?" I was still pretty weak. "You pulled me out. What happened?" "We're still trying to puzzle it out. Wouldn't be surprised if you had a hand in it, you blighter. We were watching that damned cloud. Worrying ourselves to death. What with the New York going out like a light, and not hearing anything from you, we were pretty low. Then suddenly there was a tremendous detonation. The whole cloud mass collapsed like a pricked bubble, and a bottomless pit yawned underneath the ocean. And next thing we knew, our raft was yanked from under our feet, plunging and bucking in a swirl of waters. I just had time to grab hold of a stanchion when we were sucked down into a whirlpool such as I never hope to see again. Round and round we spun, the tumbling waters mountain high above us. I was buried most of the time in crashing billows. My arms were almost pulled out of their sockets. I never expected to see daylight again," Jim went on. "My hold was being broken when at last we were spewed out somehow onto a sea that looked as if 1,000 hurricanes were blowing down. I managed to get my men together, what was left of them. There were pitifully few. Later, I heard that our losses were enormous. Over 75% of our rafts on a 50-mile front were lost, and the enemy's were almost totally wiped out. When the mile-high seas had toned down a bit, we saw a huge concrete ball tossing about like a cork. Couldn't make out what the devil it was. Then someone noticed a door. We got that open, but there was a steel one inside. We had to slice it with an oxy-hydrogen flame. Inside, snug as a bug in a rug, were you. Now come on, tell me how in blazes you got in there. If you don't spell it quick, I'll bust." I sat up in my excitement. "Don't you see, they were afraid the ray might fail. They had those concrete balls stuck all around so that the officers at least could escape if it did. Their best technical men must have been running the control room. They made sure to have that specially strong. And the wave caused by the water pouring into the hole swept me right over here, just where I started from." Jim had both hands on my shoulders, was pushing me down. "Whoa, baby, whoa. That's just as clear as a darkness-rayed area. Count up to 10, and start all over again. 'Tention!" The general himself strode into the room. And then I had to tell my story straight. End of Part 3. And end of The Death Cloud by Nat Schachner and Arthur L. Zagat. Section 27 of Astounding Stories 16, May 1931. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Science Facts. A bee's breath. The breath of a bee, important because of its indication of the health of the insect in winter and of the efficiency of the sweet-producing hive in summer, was recently measured by Professor G. H. Vansell of the University of California. To do this, he conducted the air coming from the hive through a tube into bulbs containing absorbent chemicals. Allowing for the natural carbon dioxide and water of the outside air, he weighed these bulbs, getting an analysis of the breath of the hive by the amount of water vapor and carbon dioxide the chemicals in the bulbs had picked up. He found that in winter, when the bees were inactive, the average hourly water loss from the entire hive was 36 millionths of an ounce. In summer, when the insects were hard at work making honey and gathering nectar, the water loss was 25 times as great. The carbon dioxide output, however, did not even double in summer. End of A Bee's Breath. Section 28 of Astounding Stories 16, May 1931. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reader's Corner, Part 1. And That's That. Dear Editor, may I have just a little room in the Reader's Corner to answer Mr. Meek's argument and defend myself from the charge of hasty reading? You will remember that I did not write my letter immediately after the publication of the first Heaviside Layer story, but waited until the appearance of the second, a cooling-off period of 3 months. In that time I reread the story and considered it at length. I don't call that hasty reading. Besides, the flaw in the story is so obvious that even a hasty reading should suffice to find it. I can't argue about the matter of meteors because Mr. Meek has not given any figures concerning the density or viscosity of his medium, but I can say that to my way of thinking any astronomer could detect the effect of such friction on the action of meteors. They should certainly be consumed much more rapidly than if they merely struck thin air. That, however, is a minor point, and I wouldn't even mind conceding it to Mr. Meek. The point I now wish to make is much more important, and in my mind establishes the falsity of Mr. Meek's premises. In the July issue of Astounding Stories, page 7, paragraph 4, sentences 14 and 15, he states that the Heaviside Layer is composed of a liquid of high viscosity. By definition, a liquid is more dense than a gas. Therefore, the Heaviside Layer, according to Mr. Meek, is denser than the atmosphere of the earth, since the former is a liquid and the latter is a gas. The increased refraction of light as it entered our atmosphere would then be noticeable. Astronomers can even now detect refraction due to the air. The sun remains visible for some time after it has actually descended below the horizon, due to refraction. If there was a denser substance than air surrounding the earth, the refraction would be much greater. Finally, how could the atmosphere support a denser substance like the Heaviside Layer? I'd sure make for cover if I really believed that such a menace existed right over my head. Sorry to take up your space so much by an argument, but your comments on my letter really called for a defense. I hope you can find room for this. Philip Waite, 3400 Wayne Avenue, New York, New York. Dear Editor, since Mr. Waite has so generously admitted the validity of my answer to his criticism as regards meteors, I can do no less than admit that he scored one against me in his second argument. I used the word liquid. It was careless diction. Had I used the phrase composed of a substance of high viscosity, of low specific gravity, and with a coefficient of refraction identical with that of air, there would have been no argument. I am sure that Mr. Waite will admit after reflection that such a substance could be held in position, if its specific gravity were low enough, by a combination of gravity and centrifugal force, somewhat in the same manner as the ring of Saturn is held in place. Of course, any idea that the layer rested on the air and was supported in place by it would be untenable. As I said in my previous letter, I don't believe such a layer exists. If it does, I hope that no one proves it before I can get some characters off on a space flyer for an interplanetary adventure or two. S. P. Meek, Captain, Ordnance Department, USA. Right from the shoulder. Dear Editor, I know for a fact that Astounding Stories is the best science fiction magazine on the stands. I have read it every issue except the first 3, and have not yet found a bad story. The characters in other science fiction magazines seem like machines, but Astounding Stories characters seem like intimate friends. Why do Censored like some write in and start bellyaching about the cover, pages, the size, the edges, and many other things that no one but Censored would notice? If they know so much, why don't they start a magazine and put all other publications out of business? If they liked the stories, they would not care if the color of the cover was black or red, white, and blue. I get so interested in the stories that the edges of the paper do not amount to anything. And people that bellyache about such minor things prove that they do not care for the stories, and furthermore they prove that they are censored, ready for the booby hatch. There is only one thing wrong with the perfect magazine. It does not come out twice a month. I have never known a bunch of editors that have the intelligence of the staff of Astounding Stories, uncensored editor, they have never published a single story that any intelligent reader could kick about. About reprints. Whether the editors think that they should publish some or not, it is all the same to me, as they know what they are doing. I should like very much to see some stories by Burroughs, though. If I were to name your best authors, I would have to name every one that ever wrote a story for your wonderful magazine. H. N. Sager, RFD 6, Box 419, Bessemer, Alabama. Disposing of Old Stories. Dear Editor, I have observed that numerous readers request reprints. I have a collection that goes back to 1900. Since I have no more use for them, I have decided to dispense with them. Here is an infinitesimal list. A. Merritt, Through the Dragon Glass, The Moon Pool, The Metal Monster, and the Ship of Ishtar. Homer Eon Flint, Out of the Moon, The Planeteer, The King of Conserve Island, The Blind Spot, and Flint and Hall. Jules Black, Beyond the Earth Atom, and Marooned in Space. John Lewis Hill, The Dimension Wizard, and The Challenge from Beyond. Davidson Mortimer, Lost in Time, and The Amazing Empire Lost in Time, sequel to story previously mentioned. Booth Langell, The Moons of Lanisar. As I said before, this is but a small part of the science fiction stories I have. Anyone desiring stories mentioned above, or any others, please write to me. George Zambach, 459 East 155th Street, New York, New York. A Kind Offer. Dear Editor, I'm sure you will sympathize with me for reading your magazine in study hall. It is so very dull. I have 3 study halls in a row, that I have to do something to relieve the monotony. So, seeing the latest copy of A.S. at my newsdealer's, I brought it back to school after dinner. I am speaking of the February number. I very much enjoyed the Dr. Bird story. Captain Meek is always good. Phalanxes of Atlans promises to be an excellent story also. What I want to know is, why are so many mossbacks throwing brickbats? What does it matter if some of the stories are not on the scientific chalk line? A very wise man once said that variety is the spice of life. So why not take a hint, some of you would-be brickbat pitchers, and pipe down? I have read every issue of Astounding Stories published so far, and have not a brickbat to report as yet. I notice in one letter to the Reader's Corner a request for a department on rocket propulsion. I presume the writer meant on propelling rocket planes. I have experimented on rocket ships for the past 3 years, and can give some data on these as to the construction of models. For when I say ships, I really mean model airplanes. I have had this as my hobby for the past 4½ years, and can give extensive information on model building. I specialize in models powered by power other than rubber, and I took second place at the Atlantic City tournament held in October by the National Playground Association in the annual National Championships. Anyone desiring information on the rocket ship or any other type of model plane will be promptly answered by addressing their letter to me. I hope you will find room to publish this, as I like nothing better than helping someone get started on my favorite hobby, aviation. I have, however, several hobbies, including football, basketball, tennis, swimming, boating, and hiking. I live within 10 miles of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and can see from the study hall window, which I am now seated near to, 3 ranges of the mountains all covered with more than 10 inches of snow. Richard M. Evans, Box 305, Maryville, Tennessee. To the Defense. Dear Editor, some of the letters you have printed in the Reader's Corner almost burn me up. Edwin C. Magnuson asks you what you print there. Only letters praising your magazine to the skies, or occasional brickbats? Well, I might say one thing, and that is, if you did print all brickbats, as he seems to want you to, the readers would think that your magazine wasn't of much account if that was the kind of letters you got all the time, and would probably quit reading it. He also said he felt like quitting several times because the stories weren't scientific. Well, if he can show me anywhere on your magazine where it says it is a scientific magazine, I'll certainly beg his most humble pardon on bended knee. He also crabbed about your artists. If he can do better, I advise you to hire him. He also says that the paper is rotten, and that after a few handlings goes to pieces. I still have all my magazines, and have lent them several times, and the paper is still there. On his fifth statement I agree with him. You should have an editorial. Also, I would certainly like to have reprints, as there are about 6 issues I didn't get, and I imagine there are several other readers in the same boat. Hume V. Stefani makes a very good suggestion about a quarterly. I certainly think it would be appreciated and would go over big. And Robert J. Hyatt, I most certainly agree with you in your letter printed in the February issue. And if this letter is printed, which I hope it is, I hope you will see it, and know that at least one person has the same views on the magazine that you do. Buell Godwin, 101 3rd Avenue, Southeast, Lamars, Iowa. Now a Real Pest. Dear Editor, I have recently been initiated into the reading of science fiction, and as a result I am now a real pest to the magazine vendor from asking for the next copy of Astounding Stories. I have just finished your February copy, and words can't express my enjoyment. The Tentacles from Below is indeed a science fiction masterpiece. I devour eagerly Captain S.P. Meek's stories about Dr. Bird. As long as you keep Meek, you can be assured that I will purchase this magazine. The Pirate Planet proved to be a story worthy to be kept as a reprint for future issues. In fact, many of your stories are so good that it is a shame that others can't enjoy them in future issues of Astounding Stories. Wesso is a great artist, and I appreciate to the fullest extent his remarkable pictures. Yours for a continuation of your present success in editing and publishing remarkable stories. Lester P. Lieber, 542 Dalzell Street, Shreveport, Louisiana. Stands Pat. Dear Editor, although this is my first letter to the Reader's Corner of your publication, I have nevertheless been a consistent reader of the magazine since its inception. Contrary to many of your correspondents, I have nothing to say against your magazine or policy. I like its size, its artists, and most of its stories. I shall not bother to name those I do not like, because I do not believe that there is a magazine to be found that can publish stories to suit all its readers. I enjoy the serials and your 2-part novelettes, since it gives one something to look forward to each month. I enjoyed The Pirate Planet by Charles W. Diffin so much I was sorry to see it end, and I hope there will be more of his work in the future. I am particularly glad to see such writers as Captain S. P. Meek, Ray Cummings, Miles J. Brewer, Victor Rousseau, and Harl Vincent as regular contributors to your pages. But there are also a number of other writers whom I miss seeing in our mag. Of these are A. Hyatt Verrill, who writes so well of the Incas, Otis Adelbert Klein, who also gives us excellent stories, and Leslie F. Stone, whose Men with Wings and Women with Wings appeared in another magazine, and which I enjoyed exceedingly. I believe that to have these writers as regular contributors would add much to the interest of the publication. With the compliments of an avid reader of science fiction, I salute you. Theodore Morris, 1412 Southwest 13th Street, Miami, Florida. Under My Collar. Dear Editor, I have been reading Astounding Stories for a good while, and I like it fine. I noticed in your last issue that a fellow by the name of Edwin C. Magnuson was kicking about the Reader's Corner. Some of his reasons, I think, for not liking this magazine are as follows. First, the illustrations are poor. I believe they are good. Second, he says that he doesn't like stories such as those written by Charles W. Diffin, Jackson Gee, Murray Leinster, and Victor Rousseau. He also has in his letter a list of authors whose works he likes. I do not think they are so hot, with the exception of Captain S. P. Meek. Mr. Magnuson also says he is disgusted with Astounding Stories and would like to quit reading it. Well, why doesn't he? I want to say it is a fine mag. I don't like to be a critic, but that fellow got under my collar. The only thing that could be done is to publish at least twice a month. Well, I reckon I will sign off. Here is to Astounding Stories. A better mag can't be found. Boyd H. Goodman, 2008 McKinney Avenue, Dallas, Texas. From Franklin to Poe. Dear Editor, as a reader of Astounding Stories from the first number, I would like to comment on your magazine regarding your stories and the subject of reprints. First, You are publishing one of the best science fiction magazines on the market, and I read 3 of them. And although I agree with Mr. Magnuson and others on the subject of reprints, I do not agree with the former that the paper is rotten and falls to pieces. I have a complete file of Astounding Stories to date, and I have not noticed any signs of disintegration amongst them as yet. You could easily follow the suggestion of Mr. Stefani, and have a space for good reprints and charge a nickel more. I believe most of your readers would approve of it. The story The Sunken Empire was fine, and it is to the credit of science fiction that, in addition to interesting readers in other worlds, it has also created an interest in the fate of lands from which the Atlantic Ocean received its name. This story is reminiscent of a story which appeared in the Saturday Evening Post about 3 years ago, called Maracot Deep. In this story, a party of men, 3 I believe, descended to the bottom of the Atlantic and found a surviving colony from Atlantis, and saw reproduced on a screen events leading up to the sinking of Atlantis. It was written by the late Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and the only weak spot was that Sir Arthur had to change the submergence of Atlantis from a natural catastrophe into a judgment of the gods, whose sense of propriety was outraged by the wickedness of the Atlanteans. If you reprinted this story, your readers would eat it up. I hope that you publish this letter because I want to reply through your Reader's Corner to Mr. Richard Lewis of Knoxville, Iowa, on the subject of reprints. Mr. Lewis says he has read most of the classic scientific stories referred to. Well, so have I, but I should like to read many of them again, as would many of your readers. I have for the last 20 years been reading literary classics, but when I receive my copies of good literature or the Golden Book, I do not consider myself cheated because I find some stories in them that I have read before. The best are always worth reading at least twice. As an illustration, has Mr. Lewis ever read the following: The Qasidah, by Sir Richard Burton, who gave the world its best literal translation of the Arabian Nights, which differs as daylight from dark in comparison with the Lane and Payne translations, which are only edited for children to read? Or has he read the chapter which Benjamin Franklin added to the Bible? If Mr. Lewis read these for the first time in any magazine he takes, he would no doubt consider them well worth the price of the magazine or more. Yet they would be reprints. The last one about as old as the United States. The Qasidah is a long poem on philosophic aspects of evolution in which almost all science fiction readers are interested. It contains lines like the following: Conscience was bred when man had shed his fur, his tail, and pointed ears. And as a dissertation on our caveman ancestors, they fought for women as for food, when maize awoke to warm desire, and this the lust that changed to love, when fancy lent a purer fire. Regarding the Franklin chapter, it is stated that wise old Ben used to insert it between the pages of the Bible and read it to his friends in the city of brotherly love, and great was the consternation of many who thought they knew the Scriptures from cover to cover. Any new readers of science fiction would be glad to read The Girl in the Golden Atom, The Fire People, and The Man Who Mastered Time by Ray Cummings. I like to read this author's work, but I believe when he wrote this trilogy of matter, space, and time that he reached the heights of his writing. I have never read any subsequent writings of his that I thought exceeded them. Speaking of the necessity of authors eating, Mr. Lewis states that good stories have never been written on an empty stomach. Edgar Allan Poe, who wrote Shades, was one of the most brilliant of American writers, and his stomach was empty most of the time. And when this master of ratiocination had on rare occasions a full stomach, it was invariably full of hooch. As Mr. Lewis speaks as a pedagogue, is it not a physiological fact that an empty stomach clears the mind by diverting the bloodstream from the necessity of digesting food? And while I am not advocating any fast cures for authors, some of them, although few in Astounding Stories, would be greatly benefited by trying it. In conclusion, I should like to say to Mr. Lewis and others who take the same slant on reprints, that there are many of the finest writings in science fiction and the classics which you and I have never even heard of, much less read. I will close with best wishes for your continued success. Joseph R. Barnes, Cache Junction, Utah. Now feeling better. Dear Editor, Well, I guess I've just about gotten you exasperated with all the brickbats I've been cannoning into your office. However, I believe this letter will make you feel a little better. The latest issue was fine. There wasn't a story in it that I didn't enjoy. The Tentacles from Below was a surprisingly good story, especially when you consider that I don't like sea stories. I liked this one very much. Another extremely great surprise was Werewolves of War. From the few notes about it, I surmised that it was another of those hero dying and saving his country stories. And it was, but not the kind I expected it to be. The author's narrative and descriptive abilities were such that I forgot all about the plot running through the story. Hang on to that fellow. The other complete story was also good. The conclusion of The Pirate Planet was also good, as were its preceding installments. The first installment of Phalanxes of Atlans was unusual. That's going to turn out to be one of the best stories you've yet published, or I miss my bet. G. Kirshner, Box 301, Temple, Texas. Paper is durable. Dear Editor, while reading the Reader's Corner in your January issue, I noticed a bit of criticism by Edwin Magnuson of Duluth, Minnesota. In it, he said that you have printed some stories containing little or no science. But first, most of your readers like a little change in a subject, and I advise one or two of these about 2 or 3 months apart. Secondly, the paper is of durable material, for I pass my magazine to my friends who read it and then return it with very few pages torn. Third, I agree that reprints would be a blessing, for most of your readers have not read stories by Cummings, Brewer, Wells, and Vincent. Fourth, the fact that some stories have not a sound scientific basis is quite all right, because every fair reader likes his stories fired with some imagination. Walter Witt, 960 Dutchess Street, St. Paul, Minnesota. Suggestions. Dear Editor, although I have read every issue of A.S. since it came out, I have never written about it, and this is what I have to say. First, it is just as good or better than 2 other science fiction magazines that I can name. Second, in my opinion, you have some of the best modern authors, such as Cummings, Meek, Rousseau, Diffin, Vincent, and Hamilton, also others. The stories have been A1 with the exception of Murder Madness, which in my opinion does not belong in a magazine of this type, but in a detective story magazine, because that is all it was, a detective story. And when are you going to have a sequel to The Gray Plague by L.A. Eschbach, which appeared in the November issue? It deserves one. The best author on your staff is Captain S.P. Meek, whose Dr. Bird stories cannot be equaled. They are science stories plus. A few suggestions, an occasional reprint. It would not affect the living conditions of our present-day authors and would give us all a chance to read a classic of yesterday. Do not change the size, in other words, width and length. But as for enlarging it in the thickness direction, you have my heartiest encouragement. I notice that one of the other magazines has changed its size, so now you are not alone. Evening up the edges of the sheets would improve the looks, however. And now that you have had your first birthday, when are you going to start a quarterly? In it you could publish a complete book-length novel and 7 novelettes. By novel, I mean a story about 100 pages or more of your present size, and novelettes 50 pages or more. You could double the price because a quarterly is worth double what a monthly is worth. Your artists are great, but you could still improve by having them make a full-page illustration at the start and one more exciting one as the story progresses. Well, I think I've said enough good things about you and enough suggestions. So until January 1932, adios, au revoir, etc. Henry Benner, Cowith, Washington. End of Part 1. Section 29 of Astounding Stories, 16, May 1931. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Reader's Corner, Part 2. Ouch! Dear Editor, personally I would rather read a good short story than the 10 pages of instructions by readers published in the March issue. 2 pages are plenty, especially when half the criticisms concern paper, size, edges of paper, etc. AS is okay. How about that other short? Don Ward, 6 Ketchel Street, Auburn, New York. Likes action. Dear Editor: I have just finished the February issue of Astounding Stories. All of the stories were so good I couldn't tell you which one is the best. The Phalanxes of Atlans and the Tentacles from Below were very good. I liked the Black Lamp, too. It is up to the standard of the rest of the Dr. Bird stories. The Pirate Planet ended very beautifully. However, I did not like that about Sykes getting killed. Werewolves of War was good. It ended differently from most of the other stories. Most of them end with the hero escaping, but in this the hero was killed. It had a very good plot. I got my first copy of Astounding Stories last July, and I haven't missed a copy since. Why not put out Astounding Stories twice a month? Or make it a weekly? I hate to have to wait a whole month before I get another copy. I believe that the best story I have ever read in this magazine was The Invisible Death by Victor Rousseau. The reason I like Astounding Stories better than any other science fiction magazine is that most of the other magazines have too much science and not enough action. Dale Griffith, 437 Carson Street, San Antonio, Texas. To satisfy myself. Dear Editor: It has been long since I read the February issue of your magazine, and I'm waiting anxiously for the March issue. The February issue had some very good stories, and I just must say that the story entitled Werewolves of War is the best story of its type I have ever read. Unlike most of these stories, there is more future truth than fiction. Perhaps you didn't expect to hear from me so soon again, but I am interested in this type of story as I used to write this kind in my English class back in high school. My stories were of this type, but always different from any that the rest of the class wrote. Another thing, I love to be writing, so I take this way to satisfy myself. I do hope you will excuse me. I have one more thing to say, and that is, I only wish your magazine was put out every 2 weeks instead of every 4. Or print more stories and raise the price to 25 cents. I'm sure people will pay if they are as interested as I. Ken F. Haley, 36 Mechanic Street, Lebanon, New Hampshire. Easier to Turn. Dear Editor: I have just read the Reader's Corner of the March issue and noticed that bright remark about that super rotten story, Skylark 3. Anyone who liked that story is certainly not hard to please. It does not compare with the worst story ever published. I also read that other magazine, and I say that it has disgraced itself by Skylark 3. Everything is perfect about your magazine except that there are not enough stories in each issue. The uneven edges are just fine, for it makes the pages easier to turn. The covers are not too gaudy. The covers should depict a thrilling incident in a story. They do. Phalanxes of Atlans offers a good theory as to the whereabouts of the descendants of the Atlanteans and the lost tribes of Israel. It was keen. I conclude my letter with a warning. Do not change your type. Also, do not change your order of issue. I mean, do not make your magazine into a bi-monthly, as I see some magazines of this type have done. Robert Leonard Russell, 825 Casey Avenue, Mount Vernon, Illinois. You Tell 'em. Dear Editor: I have always considered the drawings of H.W. Wesso far superior to those of all other science fiction artists, and, indeed, much better than the work of most pulp magazine illustrators. But this cover for the March issue of Astounding Stories was remarkable even for him. It was a veritable masterpiece. So enthralled was I by the first sight of this eye-arresting picture that I stared at it for minutes on end. This snarling Titan with his mighty arm outstretched toward the tiny figures just beyond his reach. What a gripping tableau! Free from the superfluous, uninteresting machinery and apparatus that clutter up most illustrations in other science fiction magazines, your March cover remained fantastic, but human. A picture that expressed the very essence of super-scientific fiction as presented in Astounding Stories. Vivid in color, striking in subject, dramatic in treatment, and drawn with consummate skill, that cover must have attracted many new readers to this magazine. And the promise held out by the cover was more than fulfilled by the contents of that issue, one of your best to date. The only discordant note in the entire magazine was the yapping and ranting of certain dissatisfied, censored to appreciate the finest, most worthy publication in its field today. Booth Cody, Bronx, New York. Nothing is automatic. Dear Editor, first, I wish to congratulate you on the increasing quality of your magazine since its first issue. It surpasses all other science fiction magazines, and I haven't missed a single issue and don't intend to. What prompted me to write this letter was an article, A Robot Chemist, published in your March 1931 issue. In the article it states that a mechanical robot performed several experiments without human supervision. But, I am sorry to say, I disagree. Nothing is automatic. Foolishly, after perfecting anything that performs its work afterwards by itself, man calls it an automaton. But it is not. Did he not have to work and slave, hour after hour, day after day, and month after month to perfect it? He did. Ever since man became civilized, he has deceived himself by calling, for instance, machinery in a factory automatons. The quest for automatic machinery is as hopeless as the quest for perpetual motion. What is my idea of an automaton? Well, take a robot, for instance. Man calls it an automaton in spite of the fact that he had to slave to put it together before it did its work. My idea is this. The iron ore would come out itself, smelt itself, form itself in the various shapes and parts needed to construct a robot, then take its correct place and rivet itself. Then the radio brain, electrical eyes, and magnet hands take their place, and when it has constructed itself it will conduct the experiments, if a chemical robot, without human supervision. Thus the latter clause would be true. That's my conception of an automatic robot. Otherwise, it's just some metal doing the bidding of a master's brain. Another thing. The novelette Beyond the Vanishing Point, by Ray Cummings, is preposterous. The flesh might shrink or grow, but the bone would not. If one shrunk as did George Randolph, one's bones would burst through the flesh. But in spite of all that, I like the stories that way. Science in the years to come might discover how to shrink or grow both flesh and bones. I guess I'm taking too much of your time, so adios. J.Z., Chicago, Illinois. Hot Times in the Firehouse. Dear Editor, the first Thursday in each month I make a beeline for the newsstand and Astounding Stories. It may interest you to know that I have every issue on file that you have put out. There have been some mighty good yarns in those issues, but the one just at hand contains the best story you have ever published. Terrors Unseen, by Harl Vincent. There's an author for you. But evidently I don't have to tell you so, as you have given us quite a number of his splendid stories. Vagabonds of Space was a wow. Like some of the others who have written in, I would like to see a sequel to this. Harl Vincent is my favorite of all your authors. A close second is Charles W. Diffin. He is good, too. As your authors appeal to me, in order, I mean, I would line them up in this way. Harl Vincent, Charles W. Diffin, R. F. Starzl, Ray Cummings, Captain S. P. Meek, Jack Williamson, and Murray Leinster. I agree with Jim Nicholson of San Francisco that you should give us some stories by Francis Flagg. Here is an author you never have published, and, to my way of looking at things, he has more fresh material than most of the authors put together. Many of the things that have been copied widely and used extensively, I don't mean that whole stories have been stolen or anything like that, were originated by this fine writer. By all means, get Francis Flagg. We have just bought a story, a good one, from him. Editor. He would stand about third in my list if you had used his work before. I made it up from those whose work has been used. 2 or 3 things I notice that I would have you correct. All your stories seem to be of standardized length, either around 10,000 words or 25,000 words. Eliminate all restrictions as to word length, but make your writers boil down their work. Most stories are too long, and could be told better if cut down quite a bit. The paper and the page size of the magazine are okay, but why not smooth edges? And it is hard to keep the covers on. I wouldn't object to more pages or an extra nickel in price. Or if not that, how about publishing our magazine twice a month? After fighting a fire, there's nothing like Astounding Stories with which to unlax. You're doing a fine job, and I only make these suggestions because I want a perfect magazine instead of one that bats 97% all the time. Hope you'll have room for all this. And, oh yes, keep on with your program of no reprints. Your new yarns are better than the old ones. Let's have the new ones, and encourage our fine string of authors to do even better work. Gail Whitman, Fireman, Company No. 11, Main at 22nd, Columbus, Ohio. Correspondence Wanted. Dear Editor: Another critic is going to take his pen in hand and give you a bouquet. I have just finished reading the March issue of A.S. and think it was fine. Of all the stories you have published, I liked The Gray Plague the best. I don't care much for reprints because I like new stories the best. I would like to correspond with some of the readers of A.S. I will answer any or all letters I receive. L. B. Knutson, 629 3rd Avenue South, Minneapolis, Minnesota. A Heroine a la Mode. Dear Editor: I'm with J. H. Nicholson, who advises those who are indifferent to the scientifically possible in order to give the author a broader field in which to lay his plot. As he says, they should feel right at home with their noses stuck into a volume of Andersen's fairy tales. However, this letter is more to express the science lover's viewpoint than to sling mud at the authors. For us, the plot loses much of its kick if the science is not reasonable. Suppose for once that one of these readers who waves scientific possibility aside as secondary should pick up a plot-distorted story in which the heroine should be described something as follows. Hers was a tall, superbly built figure combining the strength of a horse with the gentle curves of a hippo. When she spoke, her sweetly modulated voice was as pleasant to the ear as the bray of a Spanish jackass. Her hair hung to her waist, and was the convenient nesting place for several English sparrows. She was slightly cockeyed from birth and had had her nose squashed in a saloon brawl. She carried herself with the graceful dignity of an African orangutan, and was always much sought after, having a quaint habit of slapping every new male she met a resounding whack on the back that loosened their bridge work. Being a veteran tobacco chewer, and having high blood pressure, she could spit 100 feet against a 50-mile wind. When she ate in company, she had an amusing way of gargling her soup in G-flat. It's unnecessary to go further. Such a character would be every bit as reasonably possible as some of the science these science-conniving readers are willing to sanction. Here are some of the seemingly impossible feats of a recent story. 1. A diver in an ordinary diving dress is able to stand the pressure at 3 miles down. 2. Granting the above is possible, a diver shoots up 3 miles without stopping and still does not become a victim of the bends. 3. Granting the above too possible, a diver, after shooting from such a great depth and pressure to a depth of comparatively low pressure, would not be able to lower the pressure inside his dress, since it would be held so rigid that he would not be able to bend his arms. 4. A man or animal suddenly released from the enormous pressure of about 300 tons to the square inch, to atmospheric pressure, it seems would most certainly burst before the internal pressure could equalize itself. Please notice that I said seemingly wrong. I'm for A.S. just 100% and would prefer to have it as right as possible. I don't like crank letter writing, and would never have written this now if it hadn't been for several of the letters in the March issue that gave me a touch of Hades under the collar. So long. Maybe I'll write again sometime when I get some more ham science ideas. William S. Lotch, 1 Morrison Avenue, Troy, New York. You make them adequate. Dear Editor: Thanks. Of course I accept your invitation to the Reader's Corner. I have been a constant reader of your magazine since its appearance on the science fiction horizon, and I have yet to meet a story that I failed to read in its entirety or that I didn't like. To merely write a letter and say that this story was good, the other story was fair, and oh my, how poor the third story was, is futile. But as it is the usual custom to do so, here goes. Excellent stories, all of the first 5 volumes. Good stories, who's interested? Poor stories, where are they? Good authors, takes up too much room and time. Poor authors, got tired looking for them. All I want to say is, Astounding Stories is the best or one of the best magazines on the market. Gee, but aren't words futile when you describe something great and wonderful? Herbert Goodket, 707 Jackson Avenue, New York, New York. Ain't It Too Awful? Dear Editor, I knew it. It was bound to come. At last my efforts have been rewarded. Fame has sought me out, even in Brooklyn. It was suggested in the March issue of Astounding Stories that I, Louis Wentzler, as one of the active contributors to the Reader's Corner, regale your readers with a description of myself, my interest in science fiction, and how I got that way. A picture was also requested, but this had better be omitted. As for my personal history, bend an ear. At the tender age of 4, while making mud pies on the doorstep of my home, I was beamed by a brick hurled by an uncouth ruffian across the street. The results were not fatal. Who said unfortunately? But from that moment I developed a taste for science fiction. Had it not been for that incident, I might have grown up a normal lad. But the caress of that brick on my cranium did things to me, and I have been a science fiction addict ever since. Of course, I do not contend that all science fiction fans were hit by bricks, though a lot of them should be. I do believe, however, that a slight concussion of the brain helps one appreciate science fiction the more. Anyway, once imbued with the urge, I took to science fiction like a Hindu to hashish. Such stories were rare in those days, but I started to collect all I could find. Then came the war. I was too young to fight, but I did my bit making canteens out of old sieves. That was how my mind worked, you see. Well, the war ended. I forgot who won. And I went back to my beloved science fiction. Years have passed since then, and I have a fine collection of stories now. Should any of you care to see them, come around to the local booby hatch sometime. You'll find me in padded cell number 17. Louis Wentzler, 1935 Woodbine Street, Brooklyn, New York. Hurrah! Dear Editor, except for a brief letter of criticism in the August 1930 number of Astounding Stories, I have been a silent but loyal follower of the magazine since its first issue. My silence was that of profound satisfaction. Almost all the stories suited me to perfection, and the few I did not like were hardly worth commenting on. Since the magazine has grown better with every issue, I would probably have kept my peace. But there is one disturbing factor which impels me to write again. I refer to the irresponsible outbursts of certain censored who squeeze into the Reader's Corner and sputter out senseless denunciation of the magazine, its appearance, its policies, and so on. I do not object to logical, well-founded criticism, but I most decidedly do object to the censored remarks and invidious comparisons indulged in by various censored readers. It's about time someone told them where to head in, and by your leave, I'll do it. The most recent offender is J. Vernon Shea, Jr., a Pittsburgh lad of 18 who in the March issue ventures to criticize the grammar of Ray Cummings, call the editor harsh names, and demand that the magazine conform to his own dizzy notions. He concedes that Astounding Stories prints consistently interesting tales, but charges that the editor is indifferent to the advancement of science fiction. Mr. Shea, can't you see that the publication of first-class stories, as in this magazine, is the best possible way to popularize science fiction? Or do you simply prefer inferior stuff? Then there's D.R. Guthrie from way back in Idaho, who liked a yarn in another magazine so much he had to tell us all about it, as if we didn't have the best science fiction ever written right here in Astounding Stories. Guthrie's another who seems to prefer brass to gold. Going back an issue or two, we note a letter from Edwin Magnuson, a deluded denizen of Duluth, who says he's plumb disgusted because Astounding Stories receives far more bouquets than brickbats, when according to him the mag deserves to be panned plenty. Get in step, Edwin. You're falling way behind. And I mustn't forget M. Clifford Johnston of the Newark Johnstons, who calls Astounding Stories trash and its readers morons. Well, there are various degrees of mental incompetence, and the moron is far above the idiot, Mr. Johnston. Now that I've taken a few hasty pokes at those who most deserve them, I'll give my own comments on some of your latest stories. and anyone who feels like telling me where I get off is welcome to do so. First, let me take my hat off to Jack Williamson. I never thought much of his stuff in other mags, but his The Meteor Girl was a mighty fine piece of work. Evidently you've got to be good to crash Astounding Stories. Interesting as it was, though, Williamson's yarn contained a noticeable error. In the story, the narrator and his friend witness an event occurring 12 hours in the future at a distant place. They then travel to that place, reaching it at a time exactly corresponding to the time of the event witnessed. Therefore, they should have seen themselves in the future scene, an obvious fact which the author either failed to consider or conveniently ignored. But by the story, they did not arrive at the rock until just after the events they witnessed by means of the fourth dimension. Thus, everything is okay. Take another look. Editor. Despite this flaw, the story embodied several original ideas, had plenty of action, and was well told. We can stand more of Williamson. Phalanxes of Atlans by F. V. W. Mason was a corker. When writers of Mason's standing turn to science fiction, we fans have much to be thankful for. Is there any chance of our getting a story by Fred MacIsaac, Theodore Roscoe, or Earl Stanley Gardner? All of them are first-class writers, and they can handle science fiction better than many who have specialized in that field. The only other suggestion I can offer for improving the magazine is to have additional illustrations within the stories, such as Wide World Adventures used to have. Satisfied as I am with Astounding Stories, it will probably be a long time before I write again, unless I feel called upon to administer a few more verbal spankings to certain obstreperous individuals. Sears Langell, 1214 Boston Road, New York, New York. End of Reader's Corner. And end of Astounding Stories 16, May 1931. Section 26 of Astounding Stories 16, May 1931. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Death Cloud by Nat Schachner and Arthur L. Zagat. Part 3. Mechanically, I obeyed the sergeant's barked commands. We were in single file. We were moving toward that ominous table where the Ferret stood, a sardonic smile on his sharp-featured face. I could make out a livid wheal across his throat. I had left my mark on him. That was some satisfaction. The head of the line reached the table. They were fingerprinting the leader. A lieutenant extracted a paper from the pile and handed it to the Ferret. He made momentary comparison of something on the paper with the mark the soldier had just made. Then the next man stepped up, while the first made off across the plain. Of course. Simple. How very simple. And yet it had caught me. The service records of the men had their fingerprints, just as in our own forces, and each man in the area was being checked up. Trust the Ferret to think of that. He knew that I'd be somewhere in their ranks impersonating one of their men. Well, I was in for it. The last trick in our long game was his. My turn. No use going through the motions. I bent down a moment, then straightened. "Oh, hello, Bolton," the Ferret said, thrusting out his hand, the one with the twisted finger. I had resumed my own visage. "Didn't think you could get away with it, did you?" Chagrined as I was, I put a good face on it. The Ferret and I had run up against each other many, many times. Cheerfully, either of us would have cut the other's throat, but we played the game. Being broadcast to the points of projection. That meant a powerhouse and a control room somewhere in the area. The vulnerable points. Where were they? I stumbled, and was jerked roughly to my feet. The lieutenant slapped me. "Scared, Amerikansky? You well may be. We'll have rare sport when they throw what the Ferret leaves of you into the ray." I shuddered. To go out that way, I'll be honest, I was horribly afraid. The men to whom I was shackled laughed. A dull throbbing beat at my ears, a vibration just too low to be sound. I looked about for its source. It came from my left, a concrete building, low-lying, about 100 yards long by as many feet wide. At the further end, a squat smokestack broke the flat line of the roof. Guards, many guards. were pacing their slow patrol about it. From the center of the side nearest me, cables thick as a man's trunk issued forth. I followed them with my eye. They ended in a marble slab on which rested a concrete sphere, somewhat larger than the others. The door of this one was closed. On the roof of the queer edifice was a peculiar arrangement of wires, gleaming in the artificial daylight. This building, too, was heavily guarded. I had found what I sought: the power house and the transmitting station. Much good it did me now. My warders turned sharply to the right. I glimpsed another concrete structure. A heavy steel door opened, then clanged shut behind us. The fetid odor that means only one thing the world over folded round me. I sprawled on the steel floor of the cell into which I was thrust. A wave of utter fatigue engulfed me. I felt great weariness of body and despair of soul. I had failed in my mission. The fate of my country had been entrusted to me, and here I was in a steel-floored, steel-walled prison cell. And that tunnel was rushing toward New York at 3 miles an hour, over 70 miles a day. I think I slept from sheer exhaustion, but something startled me into awaking. The dim light filtering in from the tiny air hole high up on one wall showed me that I was still alone. I lay, listening. There it was again, a wailing scream of agony that rose and fell and died away. I heard a grating sound at the door, and it opened and shut. Rubinoff, the Ferret, had entered. "Comfortable, Captain Bolton?" he asked, and there was more than a hint of mockery in the velvety voice. In the hand with the twisted finger was his ray tube. It pointed steadily at me. I got to my feet. I was in no mood for trifling, for that scream had shaken me. "Cut the comedy, Rubinoff," I growled. "Kill me, and let's have done with it." He raised a deprecating hand. "Oh, come now. There's really no absolute necessity for that. You can save yourself very easily." "What do you mean?" "I can use you, if you're amenable to reason." "I don't understand." "You're the cleverest of the American intelligence men. The rabble they give me are well nigh useless. Cast your lot in with us, and in a week you'll have the riches of your greatest city to dip your hands in. It's easy. There is certain information we need. Give it to us. Then I'll get you back into your lines. We'll cook up a good tale for Summers. You can resume your post and send us information only when it is of extreme importance. Come now, be sensible." "Hello, Rubinoff," I responded. "You seem to have me just now, but try and hold me." The Ferret threw back his head and laughed. "Oh, I think you'll find it a little difficult to get away this time." I thought so too, but did not voice my thought. The smile left Rubinoff's face. He snapped an order. A squad advanced from the guard. Handcuffs clicked around my wrists. The mates of each were fastened to the arms of 2 guardsmen. I was securely chained. They were taking no chances. "Take him to the special cell in the guard house." The lieutenant saluted. I was marched off. Then I was not to be summarily executed. I was not as much relieved as you might think. You see, I knew the Ferret. We had raided one of his hangouts once. Just missed him. But we found an MIS man there whom Rubinoff had been questioning. We thanked God when he died. We tramped across the plain. My eyes kept roving about. There wasn't much hope for me, but miracles have happened. Most of the scattered structures were hastily thrown together sheds of sheet iron. Barracks, they looked like. But every so often I spied spheres of concrete, the wide open doors revealing yard-thick walls. What could be their purpose? Something bothered me. Something about the ray projectors and the other machinery I had seen. I glanced up at one of the balloons floating high above. All these needed a power supply. Tremendous power to accomplish what the ray was doing. And there were no cables running to them. How did the power get to them? There was only one answer: radio transmission. The required energy, perhaps the very ray vibrations themselves, were being sensible. At first blush, this was an astounding proposal. But I knew my man. He needed to know something. Once he had extracted the knowledge he sought from me, I should be disposed of. He'd never let me get back into our lines with what I had found out. It might have been policy to play him. But what was the use? "No, Rubinoff. You know I won't do it." He sighed. "Just as I thought. Honor, country, and so on. Well, it's too bad. We should have made a wonderful team. However, You'll tell me what I want to know. What are the defenses within 50 miles of New York?" I laughed derisively. "You'll save yourself a lot of trouble if you tell me, Bolton. After all, death in the ray isn't so bad. Whiff, and you're gone. Don't force me to other measures." There was a grim threat in his voice, but I simply shook my head. "Stubborn, like all the other Anglo-Saxons. Well, I've got something to show you." He raised his weapon and glanced at it. "Pretty little thing, this. Not the ordinary ray tube. Only field officers have these. Look." He pointed it at the wall from behind which that scream had come, and pressed the trigger button. A tiny round hole appeared in the steel. "Neat, isn't it? Utilizes the same ray you saw at work in the tunnel. The Zeta ray, we call it. Just think what that would do to human flesh." I said nothing. "But that isn't what I had in mind. Just look through that hole." I wanted to see what was on the other side, so I obeyed. The thing that lay on the floor within, could it ever